and the topic of this debate is that ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia. The affirmative team seated to my right is from Emmaus Christian College. The negative team seated to my left is from Temple Marion Middle School. The speaking time for this debate is 6 minutes. A single warning bell will sound 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will sound at the speaking time. A continuous bell may be rung 30 seconds after the speaking time, in which case the speaker must sit down immediately. Please ensure that your mobile phones and other electronic devices are switched off. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Caitlin Turner.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia. We define the topic as that the 10 known Australian women who have travelled to Iraq and Syria to marry a member of and themselves become a valuable member of Islamic State, an organisation listed as a terrorist organisation under the Criminal Code Act, and who are now held in refugee camps, as a general principle, do not have an unreviewed right to be brought back to Australia by the government. It is important to note that because of the local forces keeping them in the refugee camps and the financial situation of these women, it is impossible for them to be allowed to return to Australia without the government sending to someone to rescue them. We, the affirmative team, believe this statement to be true. Today, as first speaker, I will be talking to you about how these brides are dangerous for Australian society and that their rescue would set a dangerous precedent for others to follow their example. Our second speaker, Ricky, will discuss how it is a risky mission to rescue them and that bringing them back would be an expensive use of taxpayers' money, and also that they are not entitled to help from Australia's public servants. Our third speaker, Cameron, will rebut and sum up our team case. I will discuss 2 points. My first point is that the return of these jihadi brides would be dangerous to Australian society. The jihadi brides feel obliged by their extremist view of their religion, the most important thing to them in their lives, to kill or help others to kill those who do not share their radical perspective of Islam. They believe that to die for this cause is honourable martyrdom and will not change their mind. After all, it was for this sinister motive that they decided of their own free will to leave their lives in Australia and side with a terrorist organisation which, according to the Australian newspaper, names Australia as one of its main targets for terrorist attacks. If they are brought back to Australia, they will continue to pursue their deeply rooted ideology of violence. Even though they will find it difficult to get their hands on a gun in a maximum security prison, they can still cause damage if and when they reach the end of their sentence. And even if they are in prison for life, they can still poison the ideologies of other inmates by making use of their hatred towards their prosecutors and the prison guards. An example of this happening is the case of Mukhtar Ibrahim, who was radicalised in prison, then went on to lead a terrorist attack in London. According to Article 29 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, rights may be limited for the purpose of meeting the just requirements of morality, public order, and the general welfare in a democratic society. Allowing these women back into Australia allows them to promote terrorism here, which seriously threatens and intimidates Australian society by defying all of these principles. Australians, like everyone else, have the right, accorded in Article 3 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, to life, liberty, and security of person. My second point is that rescuing these brides, despite their history, sets a dangerous precedent that their actions were permissible, and that leaving them there discourages other people from following their example. According to the Australian Government's Department of Home Affairs, Australian citizens are granted entitlements, such as the right to participate in our liberal democracy, but also some responsibility. They are to respect the rights and liberties of Australia and to follow and obey the law. If the ISIS brides, who deliberately tried to destroy our society and are still trying, receive the same benefits as an innocent Australian citizen who has upheld these responsibilities, it communicates that being an Australian citizen is one-sided, benefits without responsibility. It is evident from their actions that these women do not believe in human rights, so why should they demand them? How will Australia enforce our ideals of democracy and other basic human rights if those who defy them to chase after anarchy and brutality are allowed to claim what they have not allowed others to gain? However, if the story of these people being left to suffer is on the front page of the newspaper for all Australia to see, this may deter future prospective ISIS brides from making this horrible choice before they surround themselves with those with a violent ideology, therefore increasing the prevalence of human rights in the world. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chairman, Article 30 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, group or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms set forth herein. The jihadi brides are guilty of deliberately trying to obliterate these rights by advocating for torture, violence and rape. It is absolutely necessary for the ISIS brides not to be rescued because it is the only sure way to shut down their evil and destructive influence on Australian society, and it deters others from doing what they did. Thank you.
I call upon the first negative speaker, Jen Rose, plus.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Chairman. The topic for tonight's debate is that ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia. We disagree with the topic given by the Affirmative team, and we define the topic as ISIS brides, girls or women who have traveled to Iraq or Syria to join ISIS, becoming brides of ISIS fighters either willingly or by force from their families while minors. Should a moral or logical obligation or duty allow being legal permission to do something, return to come back to a place? The first affirmative speaker tried to tell you that there would be a major danger to Australian society. This may be so, but the affirmative team did the affirmative team consider the potential security benefits it may play to you, the phrase, keep your friends close and your enemies closer? If the government is really suspected as ISIS brides of terrorism, wouldn't it make sense to allow them to enter Australia so they would keep their eyes on her, so they may have more intel on ISIS, the state of ISIS, either through secret surveillance of her or by convincing her to play a double agent? Don't you think that security benefits of having a source on the state of ISIS outweighs the potential security risk? She told you that all of them chose this, but according to studies done by the UN, 71% of these brides were forced to were forced by their families or manipulated or abused into becoming an ISIS bride. As a negative team, we firmly believe that ISIS brides should be allowed to return to Australia. This evening, as first speaker, I shall be discussing how it's unfair to punish someone for something they were forced to do or had no say in, and about the presumption of innocence. Our second speaker, Georgia, shall be discussing how we're putting innocent children of ISIS brides in danger by not allowing them to return to Australia, and how it's a violation of human and child rights to do so. And our third speaker, Grace, shall rebut and sum up our case. My first point is that it is unfair to punish someone for something they were forced to do or had no say in. It goes against the principles of equality and justice to inflict pain of any form upon people who had to do something against their will, or people who were too young, or people who were too young to understand or protest against what was going on. According to studies done by the United Nations, 71% of ISIS brides were either forced, abused, or manipulated into marrying terrorists, or were minors when this all happened. This is 7 out of 10 ISIS brides. Zainab Sharoof is a perfect example of this. 6 years ago, her parents brought her and her 4 siblings to a state of ISIS to give her hand in marriage to her father's best friend, Mohammed Elamu. She married him at the mere age of 13. By the age of 16, she had given birth to his daughter. Soon after, Mohammed was slain in combat, and she was forced to marry yet another man, whom she bore a daughter to. During this time, her mother had died due to illness, and her father and 2 siblings were killed in a drone attack. Before she realized she was pregnant yet again, and her 2 surviving siblings, and her daughters, and numerous other ISIS brides were rescued by an aid agency. She gave birth to a baby only 2 months ago, in a refugee camp home to 75,000 people, of whom 50,000 are children, where up to 30 people die each week. Our Prime Minister Scott Morrison had publicly stated, in response to hearing Zainab's story and her plea, that children should not be punished for the sins of their parents. She is one of the thousands of women who were forced into marriage with terrorists. Ladies and gentlemen, could you find any reason to claim that this was her fault? That this was her choice to marry a terrorist? Her decision to mother their children at the age of 13? Her decision to join the state of ISIS? How could we, in good conscience, subject her to life in a refugee camp of atrocious conditions rather than let her siblings, and her daughter return home? It is unfair to punish someone for something they were forced to do. My second point is the presumption of innocence. The presumption of innocence is that any given person is not responsible for a crime or offense until sufficient evidence is given to prove that they are responsible for committing this crime or offense. According to Australian Government Attorney General Department, the presumption of innocence is a fundamental principle of the common law. The United Nations Human Rights Committee has stated the presumption of innocence imposes that no guilt can be presumed until the charge has been proven beyond reasonable doubt. To deny an ISIS bride the opportunity to return to Australia simply on the presumption of simply because they hold terrorist beliefs and values is a direct attack on this. Or we cannot do this because we cannot place this charge on them simply because we are uncomfortable with their proximity, because this also is against an attack on this, and it is not legally, it is not a this also is not legally possible to just place an attack on someone because you don't feel comfortable around them. Ladies and gentlemen, ISIS brides should be returned to Australia. It is unfair to punish someone for something they were forced to do or had no say in. It goes against the presumption of innocence, one of the very fundamental laws of Australia and the United Nations, to refuse someone in a presumption that they are guilty without sufficient evidence. It is egregiously unjust. Thank you.
call upon the second affirmative speaker, Ricardo Raymond.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate tonight is that ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia. We, the affirmative team, believe this statement is true. The first speaker has redefined the topic, however, we disagree with their new definition. For every topic, there are going to be exceptions to any basic rule. However, due to the complexity of this topic, we must stick to the main people the term ISIS bride applies to. Of course, if a woman has been tricked into moving to ISIS territory by no fault of her own, then of course she would be held by the same protection measures of any other person who faces complications overseas. But most of these brides have knowingly taken part in terrorist organizations' motives, both before and during the time they were overseas. The first speaker has also committed a fallacy. They appealed to emotion when they mentioned the death of the family members and appealed to the public. They also said that the ISIS brides are not guilty until they've been found guilty. However, for simply traveling to the province in Syria that is a crime as the Criminal Code Act in 1995 states, because the province was blacklisted by the government, and therefore they are guilty. Our first speaker has already explained how the jihadi brides are terrorists, and their return would be a threat to our society. She also explained that by rescuing them, a dangerous precedent would be set, and is sending a message that actions as grave as terrorism are excusable. Today I will be talking to you about 3 points. My first point is that the ISIS brides are criminals, and as such the Australian government is not legally obliged to provide them with assistance to return to Australia, nor do they deserve to be allowed to return to Australia. According to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Australian citizens who travel overseas do not have a legal right to consulate assistance if they have committed illegal actions, deliberately acted recklessly, or put themselves or others at risk. On all of these grounds, the ISIS brides are guilty. Just by the very act of intentionally travelling to the Al-Raqqa province in Syria, many of these brides have committed a crime, acted recklessly, and put themselves at risk. Under Section 119.2 of the Australian Criminal Code Act in 1995, it is a criminal offence for a person to intentionally enter a declared area such as the Al-Raqqa province. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Many of the brides have a known history of advocating for terrorist acts to be carried out, which is also a criminal offence under Australia's criminal code. For example, Sierra Duman, an ISIS bride, was a key ISIS recruiter on social media, posing with machine guns on the bonnets of luxury stolen cars as she urged other Westerners to join their murderous and twisted Islamic regime. Let us be clear, ample evidence exists to show the ISIS brides are malicious criminals who do not deserve to be repatriated. Now to my second point. If the ISIS brides were allowed to return to Australia, it would put the safety of Australian diplomatic officials at great risk. To return the ISIS brides would necessitate a lot of work on the part of the Australian consulate officials, including going into the vast refugee camps where they are currently living. The environments in these camps is extremely dangerous for Australians who may be targeted and killed by Islamic State terrorists. According to Lowy Institute, there are only approximately 400 guards to keep order in Al Hol camp in Syria, which houses 64,000 refugees. Just last month, a soldier died in this camp due to stab wounds from the ISIS supporters. It is simply too dangerous of an environment to send innocent Australians, which is why Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, stated in an interview with the ABC News Radio that he is not going to put any Australian at risk to try to extract these people from those situations. My final point is that allowing ISIS brides to return to Australia would cause a tremendous expense to the Australian public purse. There is a high likelihood that many, if not all of these brides would be given lengthy prison sentences on their return for the many crimes they have committed, which I mentioned earlier. The Criminal Code Act of 1995 provides a maximum imprisonment period of 10 years for intentionally entering a declared area and lifetime imprisonment for the crime of entering a foreign country with an intention to take part in hostile activity. According to ABC News, it costs the Australian government $110,000 to keep one prisoner in prison for just 1 year. Therefore, we are facing a bill of several $1 million just to incarcerate the brides. On top of this, there would be other expenses such as rehabilitation and social security payments once they are out of prison. This money would come from the Australian taxpayer and could be used for far more deserving causes, such as helping the 731,000 Australian children that the Australian Council of Social Services estimates are living in poverty. So in conclusion, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, let us be in no doubt the ISIS brides did not leave Australia to be housewives. When they left our shores, they knew all too well that they were going to support a horrifically violent terrorist organisation that stages public decapitations, burns people alive, rapes women, and beheads children. The cost and risk involved in allowing the return of the undeserving ISIS brides to Australia simply cannot on any basis be justified. Thank you.
I call upon the second negative speaker, Georgia Matthews.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia. As the negative team, we strongly believe this statement to be false. The second affirmative speaker has already stated to you that ISIS brides are criminals and therefore should not enter Australia. He told you that it is illegal for an Australian citizen to willingly enter ISIS territories. However, only 29% of ISIS brides did this, and that only 4% of ISIS brides request to return, according to the United Nations. Therefore, 71% of ISIS brides did no wrong by entering this ISIS territory. He also stated that by allowing these women to come back to Australia is a safety risk. He said that 64,000 people were held in a refugee camp in Syria, and that when a guard came in, he was killed. But ladies and gentlemen, do we know who killed this man and whether it was a woman or a man? And this also happened within the camp, not when they were returning to Australia. Our first speaker, Jenna Rose, has already stated that it is unfair to punish someone who has done something they were forced to do or had no say in. She also said that according to the law, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. But tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I will be bringing to your attention the thousands of innocent children that are suffering from this issue. Also, how by not allowing these women back in Australia, we are categorically violating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. My first point for tonight is that by excluding these women and their children from their country, we are putting innocent lives in danger. Many ISIS brides are sent over to the Middle East for one purpose: to have children with men they may not even know. These women are being forced into childbirth and are now living with and raising their innocent children who, with no fault of their own, are living in dangerous and miserable conditions. The safety of these children is being jeopardized by the conditions we force them to live in, these refugee camps. According to David Rowe, the Defence and National Security correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald, and others, these places are known for their horrendous hygiene and safety, especially for younger children and the elderly. The state of these refugee camps is heartbreaking. Human excrement covers the floor surrounding the small houses in which people are crammed. According to the case study from the American Physiological Association, released in 2018 in their journal Peace and Conflict, the bad living conditions in refugee camps are associated with sadness, hopelessness, deep physiological suffering, and uncertainty about the future. Because of these hard conditions, the mental health statistics are violently higher than most people, and according to Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, the environment these children are put in is supporting high levels of chronic distress and severe mental disorders. Over 54% of all refugees have suffered a severe mental or emotional disorder, and over 45% of refugees have either developed or are developing PTSD. 3 out of 5 children have witnessed someone who have been physically or sexually assaulted, and 3 out of 10 have experienced physical or sexual violence themselves, and 4 out of 5 have experienced the death of a family member. Because they are left in these horrid circumstances, they do not have the professional help they may need. If Australia does not allow these women and their children to return, these are the conditions we are sentencing them to. These children inside these camps have no option to move and nowhere to move to. We are putting their innocent lives in danger. Also in David Rowe's article, 68% are children who have never witnessed the freedom and opportunity that I am sure we all believe children deserve. The environment the ISIS brides and their children are kept in for months, even years on end, are so horrific and vile that the death rate is as high as 31 a week, according to David Rowe's article. Ladies and gentlemen, by allowing these ISIS brides to return to Australia, you're also giving their children a better opportunity to survive. Now to my second point. By not allowing ISIS brides to return, Australia is breaking the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, created by the UN. According to Article 13, Section 2 of the Declaration, everyone has the right to leave any country, and including his own, and return to his country. Ladies and gentlemen, by not allowing these women back to Australia, we are violating a specific direction of the leading international legal authority. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, these women should be allowed back in Australia to give them and their children a sense of safety, so we keep our commitments to human rights. Thank you.
I call upon the third affirmative speaker, Cameron Coggins.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for this debate is that the ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia. We, the affirmative team, believe that this statement is true. The negative team has argued that we should let the ISIS brides into Australia because they are innocent until proven guilty. This is flawed logic. There is plenty of evidence that these brides harbour a deep hatred for Australian society. They have made social media posts blatantly threatening and displaying anger towards Australian society. As our first speaker has told you, these brides have been thoroughly indoctrinated and willingly believe, as a matter of deep-rooted religious belief, that Australia and the West are infidels who must be exterminated. The negative team also argued that it is better to let the brides into Australia as we can keep an eye on them. Firstly, we do not need to keep an eye on the brides, as they are already incapacitated in the refugee camps. Getting intel on their next move is not a priority, as they lack power in captivity. As our second speaker has told you, the brides pose a real threat to Australian society if they are allowed to return. Also, whilst in the refugee camps, the brides are starved of access to social media and the type of publicity and spotlight that they would get if they are returned to Australia. Furthermore, as our second speaker has told you, it is simply putting at risk the innocent lives of Australian officials to rescue these brides who have demonstrated their hatred and malintent towards Australian society. The negative team has also argued that the ISIS brides are claiming that they were pressured into going. This argument is flawed because it totally depends on a belief and trust that what the ISIS brides are saying is true. We must remember that the ISIS brides are desperate to get out of the refugee camps and would say anything to save themselves. What they are saying now is almost certainly not a reflection of their true feelings and beliefs. The ISIS brides showed their true colours when they decided of their own free will to defect to the Islamic State terrorist group, who they knew was an enemy of Australia. Many of these ISIS brides also spewed dreadful hate speech and incited violence towards Australia and the West. The Sydney Morning Herald also reports that there is a suspicion that some ISIS brides may have been schooled by Islamic State in how to assert their innocence in an attempt to get back to Australia. These duplicitous ISIS brides should not be believed. The negative team has also tried to argue that by leaving the brides there, you are condemning their children, who are innocents, to staying in the squalid camps with their mothers. When the ISIS brides left Australia, they took the decision to put their children and any of their future children at risk. It is the ISIS brides and their partners who are accountable for the unfortunate situation their children are now in. Australia is certainly not to blame for the predicament that the children are now in. Perhaps the children themselves, if they are Australian citizens, should be allowed to return to Australia, as they are innocents. But it does not follow that mothers should be allowed to follow their children back to Australia. If the children came back to Australia, they would actually be better off without the corrupting influence of their unfit mothers. They would still be able to live decent lives, living with relatives or foster families, and are more likely to grow up without being taught a hatred for Australia which their mothers harbour. This evening, our first speaker has told you that if ISIS brides were allowed to return to Australia, their presence would pose a threat to our national security. She also told you that allowing them to return would encourage other potential defectors to go overseas to fight for illegal terrorist organisations. Our second speaker has told you that because the ISIS brides are criminals, Australian law does not obligate the Australian government to assist them to return to Australia, and that the risk and cost to the Australian people in returning the brides would be significant. So, in conclusion, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, the ISIS brides should absolutely not be allowed to return to Australia. When the ISIS brides made the decision to defect from Australia to Syria to join the Islamic State Caliphate, they chose to side with a bloodthirsty, barbaric and illegal terrorist organisation which aims to destroy Australia's way of life and its people. If the ISIS brides had got their way, they would be dancing on our graves right now. If allowed to return, they would pose a grave security threat to our society, an enormous and unjustified drain on taxpayers' money, and their rescue would put the lives of Australian officials at high risk. Not only do the ISIS brides not deserve to be allowed to return to Australia, but allowing them to do so would undoubtedly be strongly against the public interest. Thank you.
I call upon the third negative speaker, Grace.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chairman. Tonight, we are here to debate that ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia. As the Negative team, we stand firm in our belief that this statement is wrong and believe that ISIS brides should be allowed to return to Australia. The Affirmative team has presented to you a case in the hopes of proving to you that ISIS brides should not be allowed to do so. They told you that ISIS brides are dangerous to society and that they do not believe in basic human rights, that they are criminals and that they will use up Australian money. Tonight, however, I shall be expanding upon what they told you and disproving their points. The first Affirmative speaker stated that Australia does not have any obligation to comply to the rules, rights and regulations of the United Nations. But, ladies and gentlemen, this is not the case. Not only is Australia a member of the United Nations, but it is a founding member. Australia has more of a duty to comply with the rules, rights and regulations set out by the United Nations than many other countries do. Therefore, we must not violate human rights by refusing entrance to Australia to ISIS brides and their families. The Affirmative speaker also tried to imply that ISIS brides deserve no help from Australia. But, ladies and gentlemen, ISIS brides are Australian citizens, and therefore they deserve help. Australia can only revoke the citizenship of a person if they have dual citizenship. These ISIS brides were born in Australia, and as they were brought over to ISIS states, which disregard the law of the country's territory they have stolen, they cannot have given ISIS brides any form of legal citizenship, meaning that Australia cannot revoke their citizenships. ISIS brides have Australian citizenships, and therefore Australia has an obligation towards them. The second Affirmative speaker has told you that a majority of ISIS brides willingly committed terrorist crimes. However, according to the United Nations, only 29% of ISIS brides willingly marry terrorist men, and 15% committed terrorist crimes. Does 29% or 15% sound like a majority to you? The second Affirmative speaker's argument was not credible. The second Affirmative speaker has also stated that some ISIS brides have committed crimes. This may be true. But, ladies and gentlemen, if these ISIS brides are legal Australian citizens and they have committed said crimes, should they not be brought into Australian territory to be properly tried? To face the Australian court of law? After all, one basic human right of the United Nations states that everyone has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. The second Affirmative speaker also attempted to disprove our point on how the Sharif family suffered the loss of family members, thus implying that their mental and emotional health and well-being weren't worth arguing. Ladies and gentlemen, this argument can easily be debunked. According to the World Health Organization, run by the United Nations, mental health is a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stress of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Mental health is just as, if not more so, important than physical health. It doesn't matter if your body is the fittest of all if your mental health is poor. And it doesn't matter if your body is broken if your mental health is good. Your mental health is the wellness of your very being, the state of your brain, the control center of your body. You cannot function if your brain is not functioning. Mental health is worth arguing for. The third Affirmative speaker has told you that there is plenty of evidence that ISIS brides have committed terrorist crimes. They implied that all ISIS brides have done this. But, ladies and gentlemen, there are simply so many ISIS brides that it is highly unlikely that this evidence proves all of them to be guilty. He also told you that ISIS brides are most certainly lying about being forced to marry terrorists. However, this is not the word of ISIS brides. This is the word of the United Nations. He went on to say that ISIS brides lack power in captivity. But, ladies and gentlemen, the affirmative team's second speaker had an example that they do indeed have power in captivity, so much power that they were able to kill a guard. Which argument can we rely on? He also stated that the women can just let their children go into Australia without them. But, ladies and gentlemen, according to the United Nations, the children and descendants of refugees are also considered refugees under international law and the principle of family unity, till a durable solution is found. It is also against the basic child rights to separate a child from their family unless there is good enough reason to do so, the single example being that the parents have been mistreating or neglecting their children, which ISIS brides do not do. Finally, the affirmative team as a whole has argued that no ISIS brides should be allowed to return to Australia, that none should be allowed to return to their homeland. The topic that ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia does not state whether we are arguing over all or a select few. The affirmative team has proven that a small amount of ISIS brides are in fact dangerous and have negative intentions. However, may I simply remind you that we are arguing a case for the many thousands of ISIS brides wishing to return, with no such intentions. I shall now move on to summarise our own case. Our first speaker stated that it is unfair to punish someone for something they were forced to do or had no say in. Not all ISIS brides willingly chose to travel to an ISIS state and marry a terrorist, and the majority of them were not even of legal age to marry. Our first speaker brought forth the story of young Zainab Sharuf, which is the story of 1,000 girls like her, forced into child marriages. How can we, as a nation, call ourselves virtuous and good when we ignore the plea of these women and girls? Our first speaker also spoke of the presumption of innocence, which is one of the firm foundations of both the laws and rights of Australia and the United Nations. Presuming that ISIS brides are guilty just because they were married to terrorists, and then not granting them permission to enter Australia on this presumption is going against one of the most basic principles of law. Our second speaker has said that by refusing to let ISIS brides return to Australia, we're refusing to let children do so, thus subjecting these children to danger. She has given you alarming statistics that prove that refugee camps are no place to raise a child in. The health risks of growing up in a refugee camp are terrible. How can we condemn children to these risks? Our second speaker also discussed the various human and child rights that are being violated whenever we refuse to let an ISIS bride and their children enter Australia. This is all relevant to us, as Australia is a founding member of the United Nations. Thank you for listening.